I'd like to talk about the book, which I admire greatly for the following reasons. That it puts beyond doubt very significant and salient realities about this industrial dispute, which have all been touched upon by Francis and the two Davids. First, there can be no doubt that Margaret Thatcher, Nick Ridley, and their associates from 1981 planned carefully for a real confrontation with the miners' union. Anybody who retains any shred of doubt about that simply has to read the chapter on it in this book, which in detail, faithful detail, shows how a series of steps were taken to build reserves of coal at the power stations to an unprecedented level, to establish a strategy committee that coordinated all of the related ministries and beyond, that prepared for a national policing strategy, and which, of course, brought to the fore the series of statutes with which industrial relations law in this country was changed. Not that the laws, as the book points out, made much difference, because the factor that was missing from Mrs. Thatcher's calculation was the suicidal vanity of Arthur Scargill as the leader of the National Union of Mine Workers. That fuels political delusion, which is why his leadership was a gift to Margaret Thatcher. People speak in the plural of the leaders of the strike of 1984-85. They make a mistake. There were lots of people in senior positions, my beloved friend Mick McGarchy amongst them, a decent, straight man called Peter Heathfield as the National General Secretary, and others on the National Union of Mine Workers National Executive, not just from South Wales, where I would have trusted with my life the people who represented the South Wales miners on the NUM-NEC, but others from Yorkshire and from Scotland and the various coalfields. But they didn't lead the strike. I don't rewrite history at all when I say that such was the domination and the exploitation of solidarity and the exploitation of a remarkable sense of discipline in the leadership and amongst the rank and file of the miners' union, that there is one person who stands accused of walking straight into the carefully laid trap of Margaret Thatcher, but to an extent and at a speed and with a lack of restraint that in her wildest dreams she couldn't have hoped for. Secondly, this book puts beyond doubt, if there is any doubt, the justice and common sense of the miners' cause, the case for coal, in the context of 1984. And we can speculate upon the advances in coal burn technology in the decades since. I would simply suggest that since the research and development in this area was being led at the time by British coal technologists, the chances are we would be at a much more advanced stage now in discovering ways of carbon capture which would enable coal in one form or another, maybe gasified, maybe liquefied, to be an even more substantial fuel than it now is in an age when rightly we are trying insufficiently, in my view, to safeguard the environment. Coal left to its raw self would always be a threat to the environment. Working against a different background from 1984 to 1985, who knows what would have happened? Maybe I'm entirely wrong. I don't think so. Thirdly, not in doubt at any time is the raw courage of the rank and file of the NUM and their families. In the communities that were dependent upon coal, to some extent you could expect months of solidarity. But what couldn't have been anticipated is the way in which support, physical support, spread out from those communities, so that people who were deeply hostile to the strike, and especially to the leadership of the NUM, subscribed with great generosity to try to ensure that the miners' families, denied any formal state benefit, would not suffer the deepest privations, although the privations they did suffer in my constituency and elsewhere were desperate, desperate. And it went on for a year with repercussions that lasted, debts that lasted, fractures that lasted, delinquencies that lasted years after that, and to some extent still echo. And again, what is not in doubt, and to some extent I repeat to emphasize, is the ruthless exploitation of that spirit of solidarity and defiance, I say without any romanticism, by Arthur Scargill. There were several occasions, as you've already heard and are listed faithfully in this book, when efforts were made to secure settlement, with various adjustments in a plan for the future of coal. And many of those attempts were entirely sincere. And there are people in the trade union movement. Norman has been mentioned. You could also add others in the leadership, Bill Keyes, for instance, of the trade union movement, who strove might and main, not to undermine the miners, but to try and rescue them from what was obviously, as the first few months passed, let alone the 12 months, going to be the most irrecoverable disaster. Those people deserve a great deal of credit. And a lot of what they argued, and a lot of their efforts to secure a civilized end that could mean a planned future, and because it's an exhaustive industry, inevitably an alteration involving closures of the production of coal, they all argued, every single one of them, interminably in discussions I had, that the one action by the National Union of Mine Workers that could have rapidly and radically altered the fortune of the miners in their communities would have been a national ballot. Because for anybody who knows the miners and the trade union movement of that day, and I don't let distance lend enchantment, I don't possess rose-tinted spectacles, anybody who knew about the realities of conditions at that time would know that a ballot, in my view, with utter certainty, would have been won for a strike. I see Seamus Milne this morning arguing that a ballot would have been pointless when, I quote him, 80% were out on strike anyway. Well, I think that would pretty much guarantee quite a substantial victory for those arguing for a yes vote to a strike. And it's an extraordinary inconsistency to say that the ballot wasn't necessary because 80% of people were out on strike in any case. But what a ballot would have done is to guarantee unity right across the mining labour force, including in Nottinghamshire, which has been regarded as anathema by too many people. I remember Nottinghamshire in 1972 and 1974 in the strikes. I remember that the inheritance of Spencerism, the scab union system, was then rumoured to continue. It didn't. The Notts miners voted, and they went on strike, and their solidarity was never in question in those two strikes, and they would, even if there hadn't been a clear majority of yes votes in Nottinghamshire, have abided by their obligations under the National Union Constitution. I've no doubt at all about that. So you would have had unity in UNUM. Secondly, the rest of the trade union movement could and would have given support more solid and widespread than it ever felt able to do in the absence of a democratic decision. I don't think anybody seriously contests that. And thirdly, of course, a ballot would have produced a sentiment in the public similar to that of 1972 and 74, except that in 72 and 74, public support was won for the miners because they'd had a ballot, and in spite of the fact that they were out on strike for a pay increase, the first national strike since the general strike. In this case, in 84-85, there was no argument in this strike that it was related to a demand for a pay increase. It was all about the future of coal and the industry and the jobs and the coal mining values in communities. In those circumstances, I even invite an audience in 2009 to imagine what the public reaction would have been to a national ballot, democratically conducted, with a patent outcome, with the solidarity of the coal miners, the unity of the union, the support from elsewhere in the trade union movement, and the integrity of not being out for money, but being out to save coal and their communities. Now, I don't have to be a romantic novelist to paint the picture of what would, in those mid-1980s years, have occurred. The strike was ruined the moment that it was politicized, and in the mind of Arthur Scargill, it was always a political strike. He'd had experience of the Greenwich picket line. He'd given himself the credit for successfully bringing the 1974 strike to the end in the Battle of Salt Lea Gates, much exaggerated, bitter, dangerous, but much exaggerated. And he fed himself the political illusion that as long as the workers were united, condition number one, they could never be defeated, and they had the right to at least destabilize, if not overthrow, democratically elected governments. That was the objective being pursued. And again, anybody who doubts that, as I've never doubted it, should read this book and see in detail that is quite remarkable the circumstances leading to that and the falsehood of Scargill's conclusion. That's why I've always condemned Arthur Scargill. The miners didn't deserve him. They deserved something much, much better. In my view, of course, Arthur Scargill and Margaret Thatcher deserved each other, but nobody else did.